It's been a while since I released the first part of this video, but now I'm finally back. So let's continue with disturbing Greek myths. We had 5 myths, or series of interconnected myths, in the first part. Now we have 5 more myths, or groups of myths actually. Scary stories. Disturbing Greek myths. Part 2. Part 1 ended with the story of Minotaur and his eventual death from the hands of Theseus. So let's continue with Theseus. He's the source of some really disturbing stories. Theseus and His Women. People usually know the basics of the myth of the labyrinth. Theseus kills the Minotaur, and together with Ariadne, they escape Crete, and then Theseus forgets to change sails on the ship, which leads to the death of his father. Well, one of his fathers. Theseus has 2 fathers. How is it possible? Well, it is possible because Theseus was basically a founder of Athens. So in the eyes of Athenians, he had to be a legitimate son of the king, and at the same time, a son of a god, not just a regular mortal. So they just developed a myth when both options exist simultaneously. Anyway, people usually know the story of the Minotaur, and that's it. Or even only a family-friendly part of the story. Because Theseus not only forgets to put white sails on his ship to send a signal that he's alive, he also forgets Ariadne, like literally. On their way to Athens, they stop on the island of Naxos. Theseus wakes up in the morning, forgets about Ariadne, gets on his ship, and leaves. And Ariadne stays on Naxos. What a gentleman. So, why did he do something like that? One of the explanations is that Theseus was an asshole. But there are others, which includes that he actually had really disturbing problems with his memory. Like, he had been genuinely forgetting stuff and not just faking it. Another version that helps to save his face is that Dionysius made Theseus forget Ariadne. Why did he do this? Oh, he spotted Ariadne on Naxos and fell in love with her. So he wanted to keep Ariadne for himself. And when Theseus had to leave the island, Dionysius entered the picture. All of this may sound quite creepy, but the creepiness kind of goes away because Dionysius actually did something unthinkable. He married Ariadne and made her immortal, at least in some of the versions of the myth. And there are lots of them, including the version that Theseus left Ariadne because he loved another woman. And yeah, Dionysius is probably a much better husband than Theseus. You will see why in a moment. At some point after returning from Crete, Theseus decided to participate in the war against the Amazons. Obviously, there are different versions of why, when, and how it all happened. The dominant version is that our brave hero visited the Amazons, who met him without any animosity and even sent gifts. The gifts were brought by a girl called Antiope, or maybe she was called Hippolyta. Different versions again. So Theseus invited Antiope, Hippolyta, to his ship and then just set sail, effectively abducting her. And that's what started the war, which was won by Athens. Theseus and Antiope had a son, Hippolytus, who is in the center of 2 famous Greek and Roman tragedies, Hippolytus by Euripides and Phaedra by Seneca. Somehow, Theseus disposed of Antiope and Hippolyta at some point. Well, there are versions that she was with him absolutely willingly and, in fact, was killed by the Amazons. And a version that she actually wanted to marry Theseus or something, but he declined the proposal and she actually invaded with the Amazon army. So, no, the abduction is not the only story we have. Anyway, one way or another, Antiope was gone. Hippolytus was more or less a grown up with some interesting ideas. becoming a hardcore follower of Artemis, which kind of implied not only long walks in the woods and hunting animals, but also celibacy. And this cult was traditionally seen as something reserved for women. By the time, Theseus obviously had another wife, Phaedra, the sister of Ariadne. I mentioned her in the previous video. Either the son of Minos or the Minos himself gave her to Theseus in marriage, because they apparently were not angry at him at all. It is possible that somewhere in the meantime, Theseus was married to Perbea, a girl whom he saved from the lustful Minos, by the way. So, Phaedra, sister of Ariadne. The tragedies by Euripides and Seneca tell exactly this famous story of how she developed feelings towards her stepson Hippolytus, while Theseus was away. And two authors tell slightly different stories, so you can check them if you're interested in particular details. Hippolytus rejected the advances of Phaedra. So Phaedra, for some weird reason, decided to tell Theseus that she was actually violated by Hippolytus and something should be done about it. The boy must be punished. That's Seneca's version, actually. In Euripides, she hanged herself and it led to a misunderstanding that she committed suicide because, once again, Hippolytus had violated her. All of this is slightly weird, but it is actually the reaction of Theseus that is really interesting. He was absolutely enraged, which is understandable, but in Seneca's version, he had no intention to double check the story, to talk with his son, no. He just asked his father, the second father, Poseidon, to kill Hippolytus. Poseidon also wasn't interested in justice, talking to his grandson or something, so he basically just killed the guy without asking any questions. And in the version of Euripides, Theseus basically ignored the arguments of his son. It all ends pretty much the same, regardless of the source. Poseidon scared the horses of Hippolytus, which led to a major traffic accident. In Euripides, he was mortally wounded and had a final heartbreaking conversation with his father. In Seneca's version, he was torn to pieces and Phaedra killed herself out of grief. As a result of this incredibly screwed up story, Theseus lost both his son and his wife in one day. Which means that, yes, he had to find a new wife as soon as possible. And finding a wife is relatively easy if you're a seasoned specialist in abductions of women. Theseus had a best friend, Pirithous, son of Zeus, king of Lapiths. These two guys came up with a brilliant idea. Since they were the children of major gods, they decided that it makes sense to marry the daughters of Zeus. And Theseus and Pirithous will help each other to reach this goal. Theseus said that he wants to marry Helen, who was something like 10 maybe at the time. So these two guys traveled to Sparta and abducted Helen. Yeah. Helen was too young to become the wife of Theseus, so his plan was to wait a few years for obvious reasons and practical reasons. A bit in line with Hesiod's recommendations from Works and Days, where he writes instructions to his son that if your wife is too young, then you should wait, because come on, if she gets pregnant, she will probably die in childbirth. Except that in this particular case of Theseus and Helen, we're talking about the abduction. So Helen was supposed to stay with Aethra, mother of Theseus, and then he will return for her, kind of, because, there's also a myth, not very popular one, but it exists. It is mentioned by some authors that Helen was an actual wife of Theseus for some time, and they had like a daughter together, even despite her young age. But Helen is a different subject, and I talked about her a bit in my videos about the film adaptations of the Trojan War cycle. This story about Helen backfired at some point. Theseus went missing for some time, and while he was away, Helen's brothers, Castor and Pollux, found her, installed a new government in Athens, and took Aethra to Sparta as well, so she could be Helen's slave. And the reason why Theseus was missing is, well, it's because of his best friend Pirithous. As I mentioned, these two guys made a pact about taking the daughters of Zeus as their wives. Theseus chose Helen, so Pirithous helped his buddy to abduct Helen. Now Theseus had to return the favor and help his friend. And you'll be shocked if you don't know whom Pirithous chose as his potential wife. Obviously, desperately needs to be abducted in order to become his spouse. He chose a character we talked about quite a lot in the previous video, Persephone. Yeah, they decided to abduct Persephone, the wife of Hades. They packed their bags and went to the underworld. That's why Theseus was missing. He couldn't leave for some time, until Heracles went to the underworld and set Theseus free, uh, kind of with the blessing of Hades. And Pirithous, he stayed there forever. Hades was really amused by the amount of hubris this man could generate. As I told before, I try to connect all of the segments in the Disturbing Greek Myths videos, so our next segment will be dedicated to the stepmother of Theseus. At least she used to be his stepmother for a while in some of the myths, and she tried to kill him. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about this wonderful person, one of the best wives anybody can possibly have. Medea. Medea's story is incredibly famous because of the play of Euripides and, once again, a version of the play by Seneca. Both plays don't concentrate on all of her biography, but on this episode when Jason decided to marry another woman and Medea killed the girl, her father, and then her own two children, just to make Jason really, really sad. I'm sure you all know the basic outline of this episode. So the first thing we have to address here is this version of Euripides, which obviously also inspired Seneca's work, is only one version of the myth. There are obviously versions where she doesn't kill her own children. They are killed by somebody else, which shows Medea in a completely different light. Okay, in somewhat different light. It is even quite possible that the story of Medea killing her children is the invention of Euripides, who was a well-known revisionist of the myths. He was the kind of person who could probably cast black actors as Greeks if he felt that the story really needed something like this. And he was quite deep. He was augmenting the familiar for his audience, mythological material for a reason. Since his play became over time one of the greatest surviving Greek tragedies, Medea of Euripides kind of overshadowed all the other variations. Second, Medea is a complex work. Euripides is addressing many interesting issues there, and you can interpret some of the things he says in more than one way. We're not analyzing his work here, we're discussing it very briefly, but you have to be aware of the situation. For example, Medea is sometimes interpreted as more or less proto-feminist material, because indeed the character of Medea is touching on the subject of, let's put it this way, the role of a woman in a traditional ancient Greek household. We talked about this a little bit in the first part of the video when we were discussing the myth of Persephone. And it should be noted that even though the play takes place in Corinth, Medea is obviously an Athenian play, so Euripides was mostly talking to the Athenian audience. Euripides is sympathetic to Medea and not crazy about Jason's behavior at all, but at the same time, he's probably quite nuanced in his approach. He's sympathetic, but Medea is a practically irredeemable, horrible, and dangerous creature who, at some point in the Greek original, basically starts talking like a snake. And she's basically an evil witch. It runs in the family. When she is portrayed as some sort of a feminist, well, you might have some questions about what people are actually thinking and why they are doing this. Regardless of Medea's outrageous behavior in Euripides and Seneca, once again, she kills her own children to break her husband's heart. Her previous and later adventures were quite scandalous as well. Right from the beginning, she was probably a priestess of Artemis or Hecate, which is practically the same thing, actually, and apparently was ritually sacrificing foreigners in her native land of Colchis. She was supposed to kill Jason as well, but she fell in love with him, which is usually attributed to the fact that Aphrodite was helping Jason, so it all was part of the plan. Anyway, Medea betrayed her father, helped Jason to obtain the Golden Fleece, took her brother Absyrtus, and in order to slow down the ship of her father, who was chasing Jason and Medea, she started cutting him, Absyrtus, into pieces and throwing his body parts into water. So, as you can see, there was a lot of internal logic for the version of Medea in Euripides to be developed. This is exactly a type of person who might, start killing her own children. She actually had a thing about cutting people into pieces. When Jason and Medea came back to Iolcus, Jason's homeland, Medea participated in an interesting plot against the king of Iolcus, Peleus, who was the enemy of Jason and an usurper. The daughters of Peleus were impressed by Medea's sorcery. She managed to reinvigorate Jason's father, Aeson, and also demonstrated how she can return youth to a person or an animal. She took an old ram, cut him into pieces, and put him into a cauldron with boiling water and magic herbs. The ram came back from the cauldron alive and young. So the daughters of Peleus cut their father into pieces, put him into the boiling cauldron, and nothing happened, because Medea had no intention to use magic herbs on him. It didn't help Jason in his plan to return his kingdom back. He was forced to leave Iolcus after this outrageous incident. Jason and Medea traveled to Corinth, and you know what happened next, or at least this version of Euripides. After her adventures in Corinth, Medea went to Athens using a magic carpet, or magic chariot provided by her grandfather Helios. Why Athens? Well, the king of Athens, Aegeus, promised to marry her, or something. I mean, marrying Medea, given her backstory, seems like an incredibly strange idea. Probably the most disturbing idea out of everything we've heard this far. I mean, a promise is a promise, but this is not a person you want to have anywhere near you. All this makes Medea a stepmother of Theseus. She also had a son with the Aegeus, Medus, only one son. But this is not a situation with Jason when the number of children Jason and Medea had together is different with every source and every variation of the myth. She kills two sons in this play of Euripides, but some sources imply that Jason and Medea had like a dozen of children. Theseus, as you know, was brought up by his mother Aethra and appeared at the court of his father only when he was strong enough to retrieve the weapons left for him by Aegeus. The sudden return of Theseus took Medea by surprise and put the position of her own son Midas into jeopardy. Naturally, Medea tried to poison Theseus, but unsuccessfully. So Aegeus kicked her out of Athens, together with Midas, by the way. Later, they returned back to Colchis, and Medea actually helped to return the throne back to her father, which is like a very unexpected development given what happened between them before. Or maybe she put Midas on the throne because he's considered the progenitor of the Medes. Golden Fleeces and Immortality. Since I'm trying to connect all the stories, let's talk about the Golden Fleece for a while. The Golden Fleece from the myth about Jason and the Argonauts is not the only fleece we have in Greek mythology. Usually it is some kind of a royal symbol and artifact that gives you plus 100 points of charisma, something that possibly makes you eligible to become a king. although there can be a number of theories on what it may represent and why. This golden fleece from Colchis actually has an interesting, well, mildly interesting, nothing special, backstory, which involves Nephilim, this cloud entity that Ixion impregnated, thinking that it was in fact Hera. We talked about this in the previous video. And we also mentioned another fleece from the story of Atreus, which ended in the children of Thyestes going into this too. Because every time you hear a golden fleece mentioned in the myth, that means someone will be cut into little pieces quite soon. But there was another fleece, so to speak, without any royal significance. I'm talking about the herds of Helios, or the cattle of Helios in the Odyssey. It is a quite disturbing story which leads to the concept of immortality in Greek myths. Odyssey and his crew arrive on the island of Thrinacia, the island where Helios keeps his cattle. The cattle are absolutely beautiful and immortal. Odyssey was told not to touch these sacred animals, and he instructed his men to avoid killing them. But when he was away, they obviously disobeyed and started killing immortal cattle in order to, well, they really, really wanted to eat. What happened next is this. Well, the cattle were immortal. So if you skin the immortal and try to fry its meat, you might have some interesting results. Because I don't want to sound obvious or redundant, but immortals cannot really die. So the skin, the fleece of the animals, started to literally crawl and scare the hell out of everybody. Because again, the cattle wasn't really dead. And the flesh started making weird sounds. Because again, the cattle weren't dead and weren't happy about essentially being fried alive. It is a very interesting question what happened to all of these animals later, after Odysseus and his crew left. And obviously, they were severely punished by their gods. I mean, the animals probably had to spend the rest of the eternity in this skinned, chopped, and half-cooked state, because they cannot die. So let's elaborate a little bit. Let's talk about how immortality works. My main example here will be the origin myth of goddess Athena. You know this myth, but people usually don't pay attention to some of the details. Athena famously doesn't have a mother. She just emerged from the head of Zeus, grown up and in full armor. The problem here is that she kind of has a mother, but this mother is sitting inside of Zeus. He conceived a child with Metis, the goddess of wisdom. But there was a prophecy that a child from this union will eventually dethrone Zeus in a way like Zeus dethroned his own father. So in order to prevent all of this from happening, he just devoured Metis. But Metis is a goddess, she's immortal, she cannot die. Which means she's kind of integrated into Zeus now. Probably even maintains full awareness of the situation. If you cut Zeus wide open, the way he opened Kronos and set his siblings free, Metis probably will be able to walk away from this prison. Of course, Greeks never gave it that much thought and probably never concentrated much on the literal meaning of the myth, because it is absolutely not about the literal meaning. It is purely symbolic. Zeus has wisdom because he kind of swallowed and integrated wisdom into himself by devouring the goddess of wisdom. Another interesting story of immortality, and actually about becoming immortal, is the origin story of Dionysius. The most popular, the standard one, because Dionysius is probably a god of Thracian origin, and the Orphic cults connected to him. So you also have additional stories of Zagreus and stuff like that. But the default story is this. Zeus found yet another lover, Semele, daughter of Cadmus, the founder of Thebes. Hera found out about the affair and, as usual, unleashed her wrath upon the girl. She disguised herself as an old woman and gave Semele a great advice. Semele doesn't know for sure if the person she's sleeping with is a god. Gods actually disguise themselves when they interact with humans. But if a god reveals his true form, that's the proof. So Semele had to ask Zeus to grant her a wish, any wish, and swear on the Bible. On the waters of river Styx, because that means he will actually honor the oath, because gods cannot break the promise when they swear on river Styx. In all other cases, they can just ignore any oaths, they are not binding. Zeus made a promise, and then he was terrified that the actual wish of Semele is to see the god's true form. The problem here is that if a human will see a true form of a god, all his or her glory or majesty, it will instantly incinerate any mortal. And that's what happened to absolutely clueless Semele. And that's exactly what Hera had in mind when she advanced this suicidal idea. Semele was pregnant. Well, of course she was. Everybody's getting pregnant in the myths. So while Zeus couldn't do anything about Semele herself, he caught the embryo of their son, Dionysius, and preserved it. Since the fetus needed a vessel to grow, Zeus sewed it up inside his thigh, and later, gave birth to him. What is interesting here is the process of becoming immortal. Strictly speaking, Dionysius should have been a demigod, not a powerful immortal being. But something happened here. First, during the incineration of his mother, and later, when he was formed in the thigh of his father. There is a number of myths that, as I mentioned before, emphasize the mysterious role of fire in the process of becoming immortal. Like in the story of Demophon, one of the stories about Achilles, the story of Heracles burning alive and becoming a god. Same pattern here. Dionysius emerged from the fire and became immortal. Let's talk about him some more. Dionysius and the Bacchae. This is another story when we're touching on the subject of the psychology of Greek gods. One of the most famous ancient tragedies is the Bacchae, or the Bacchantes, by our man Euripides. We talked about him a bit. We don't know how much of the Bacchae is based on different folk myths and how much was made up by Euripides as he was writing his play. But this work tells some terrifying stories. You can even see it as a drama that tries to induce some existential horror in the audience. Now, there can be lots of different interpretations of the Bacchae with different layers of meanings. That's one of the reasons why this work is so important. I'm not planning to give a full analysis of the play, and I'm not sure I'm fully equipped to do that. We will discuss it briefly and point out some of the interesting things that otherwise might go unnoticed. You should obviously get acquainted with the Bacchae if you somehow never did this. But here's a short summary/recap of what happened there. Dionysius returns to his mother's hometown of Thebes. He wants to establish his own cult, which is understandable. He also apparently wants to terrorize his relatives, or his mother's relatives. He doesn't really see them as his kin. He doesn't like their previous behavior, and he doesn't like the current behavior of some of the family members. He is, one of the interpretations, essentially incredibly narcissistic, sadistic, vengeful, and petty. Also, he gives people happiness and leads them to ecstasy. sometimes very self-destructive ecstasy. As I told you, there are many layers and facets. Dionysius doesn't like that his relatives previously were suspicious about the divinity of Dionysius and his mother's endeavors with Zeus, which calls for vengeance. He doesn't like that some of them are not ready to accept and worship some new god that came out of nowhere and of whom they don't really have much information. He just thinks that that's an insult. He also doesn't reveal himself. He doesn't bother. He's disguised as a follower of Dionysius, and in this capacity, he demands from the Theban king Pentheus, uh, technically his cousin, to start worshipping Dionysius, him. Even those who don't really need any proof and immediately accept Dionysius as a new god, like his grandfather Cadmus, will be eventually punished because Dionysius is in a bad mood. And it all leads to climax when Agave, Semele's sister, aunt of Dionysius, who is one of the Bacchae, intoxicated fanatical followers of Dionysius who were granted inhuman strength. Agave tears apart her own son, King Pentheus, and brings his severed head to Cadmus, because she was in a state of Dionysian frenzy and actually thought she's fighting a lion and winning. We don't really know the intentions of Euripides. He gives us a complex picture that makes you ask questions about gods, their intentions, their relationship between divinity and humans, religious ecstasy and intoxication, fate, justice, retribution that comes out of nowhere, retribution you don't really deserve at all. There's even an interpretation that Euripides, again, I should say, tried to introduce some quite atheistic ideas or some interesting angles on the traditional myths, which will make you question the gods or the stories that people tell about gods, which, again, might lead us to the gods of Plato, who are perfect and just, unlike these weird stories people tell. There are hints on this kind of reinterpretation of traditional beliefs in other works of Euripides as well, most prominently in Heracles. If you meditate a little bit on what the Bacchae is telling us about the gods, well, and other things as well, that's really, really dark. Don't mess with the immortals. Even if on paper it gives you nothing but joy and happiness. Like in this story of Tithonus, a short but horrifying story that I chose as a fitting conclusion to this video about disturbing Greek myths. Tithonus and Eos. Tithonus was, or is, a son of the Trojan king Laomedon and the elder brother of Priam. At some point, the goddess of the dawn, Eos, kind of fell in love with him, so she abducted Tithonus, and they started to live together, they had children, and so on. Aias didn't like the fact that Tithonus at some point will inevitably die, and their happy marriage is gonna end. And she did quite an exceptional thing. She asked Zeus to grant immortality to Tithonus. And Zeus agreed. The problem here is that the goddess of the dawn has a very bad memory. She asked for eternal life for her lover, but forgot to ask for eternal youth. And over time, Tithonus became a quite hideous old man, and a man who was deeply unhappy with how things turned out. Because essentially, he wasn't only old, but apparently he was becoming older and older over time. He started shrinking and became quite small in size and had to be kept in a wicker basket like a baby. He was so frail, he no longer could move. He could only lay still, complain, and curse his fate. Eventually, Eos turned him into a cicada. This is really scary if you think about it for a moment. Later, this myth also inspired the more or less analogous story of Roman Sibyl, who also had eternal life and no youth. So she shrunk into a cicada and was kept in a small cage. Children used to ask her, Sibyl, what do you want? And she invariably replied, I want to die. I think this is a good way to finish the video on disturbing Greek myths, because all of this is quite existentially disturbing. Obviously, there are lots of other quite scary stories, like certain myths about Heracles, which includes his madness, his death, his encounter with Procrustes, the backstory of Medusa, the myth of Tereus and Procne, and so on. Maybe we'll deal with them some other time. And for now, thank you for watching, and see you soon.